Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Stein, and I'm the State Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. On behalf of Policy Integrity, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar on transmission planning under uncertainty, PJM state participation in Order 1920 scenario development. The Institute for Policy Integrity is a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to improving the quality of government decision-making through advocacy and scholarship in the fields of climate and energy law, economics, and public policy. Our speakers will be Jennifer Danis, the Federal Energy Policy Director at Policy Integrity, Christoph Graf, Policy Integrity's Senior Economist, and Kelly McGee, who is a legal fellow. We will be saving about 15 minutes for a moderated question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Feel free to send questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for more information about any of the information covered in this presentation, we encourage you to check out our report on the topic. I'll leave a link to the report in the chat momentarily, and I'm going to pass the mic to Jen for an overview of the webinar. And next slide, please.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Our presentation today will give recommendations for various stakeholders, including governor's offices, state energy and air regulators, state public utility commissions, and non-government entities on how they can effectively participate in long-term regional transmission planning under FERC's Order 1920. At a high level, Order 1920 requires grid operators to plan for regional transmission grid that will meet future energy needs in a cost-effective manner. One key Order 1920 requirement is for grid planners to develop at least 3 long-term scenarios identifying where new transmission capacity is likely to be needed. We will focus only on the scenario development process. Today, we're not covering Order 1920 requirements for project evaluation and selection or cost allocation, although scenario development does influence those other Order 1920 processes. As our webinar title suggests, we're also focusing on Order 1920's implementation within and by PJM, the largest regional transmission organization in the country. But much of the content we present here will also be relevant to states outside PJM because it includes the mechanics of scenario development and transmission planning modeling. Christoph will now give us an explanation of what scenario development entails and how it fits into the transmission planning process. I'll then cover Order 1920's requirements for scenario development and highlight opportunities for state participation. And then Kelly will provide specific recommendations on how states can give relevant input for the 7 categories that Order 1920 requires PJM to include in the scenarios it uses in each planning cycle. Christoph, we're ready for you to demystify the mechanics of scenario development. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Jen. Scenario development is part of the transmission modeling process that PJM and other ISOs in the countries use to identify where new transmission is needed. One challenge of transmission planning is that there is uncertainty about the future, about how the future grid will look like. Including how resources mix and demand will change. And that's the reason why we actually plan using different and diverse scenarios. I'll talk about this a little bit more. At a high level, a scenario is a set of consistent and plausible assumptions about the future electric grid. The scenarios contain multiple data inputs or variables that go into the transmission planning model. This could be like demand growth, generation capacity factors, anticipated retirements, available technologies, and financial parameters. And as a result of the scenarios going into the model will lead to outputs that will inform transmission planning decisions. But again, it's very important that we include not only one scenario, but we include like a wide range of scenarios. In the order is making it explicit to use at least 3, but more is always welcome in this kind of modeling process. Next slide, I give an example what scenario development could look like. This is an illustrative example of how PJM might develop 3 different scenarios that each incorporate 4 factors. We'll choose here like the peak summer load projection for 2040, the cost to install solar installation, the natural gas price projection for 2040, and some assumptions about retirements. In the central scenario, like in the left column, the peak load projection for 2040 is 220 gigawatt. The capital expenditure for solar is around $1,000 per kilowatt. A natural gas price projection is $5 per million BTU. And for the retirement assumption, for example, we could say that all coal and internal combustion gas-fired generation is going to retire by 2035. And then we could use this central scenario and build off other scenarios on that. For example, in the next column, we have the high demand, high cost scenario, where, for example, the peak load projection would be increased by, for example, 10%. The capex of solar is more expensive than in the central scenario. Also, gas prices is are higher, expected to be higher, and the retirements are delayed because of the load growth and the higher investment and fuel costs. On the other bookend, we could have a low demand, low cost scenario. Say, for example, the currently projected data center load growth is not shaking out as we currently thinking. So there would be like less peak summer load projection, and building solar would be cheaper than in the central scenario. And also because renewables getting cheaper, the gas price will be lower. And we could have a different scenario for retirement, say like an age-based retirement classification. Okay, so PJM would then take, for example, those 3 scenarios or like variants of that and run those through its model. And each scenario will get different answers for a transmission solution. Ideally, there would be like a stochastic planning where I get one transmission solution that is robust against all the scenarios, but that's often computationally expensive. As a kind of second best approach would be to run it for each scenario separately, and then pick solutions that are that can deal with many versions of the future. Next slide. An important aspect is in scenario development is also sensitivity analysis. A sensitivity is a slightly modified version of a scenario where PJM would adjust certain inputs to represent the impact of extreme or unusual events. To assess how sensitive the model results would be to that change. As an example, on this figure here, we include like extreme days in terms of net load or normalized net load here. And what you can see, the dashed lines represent those days with extreme like demand and extreme renewable capacity factors. And you can see the top line and the bottom line are both like dashed lines, which means here we have like a wider range of possible operational scenarios and more increased operational uncertainty. And that is important to consider because transmission, but also storage capacity, including demand response, can mitigate this uncertainty. And so accounting for this like extreme weather events, you probably would get a different transmission solution. So running sensitivities robustifies the planning results and allows PJM to have greater confidence that the facility selected or needed will meet transmission needs under a wide range of future conditions. And with that, I would like to pass over to Jen.
Thanks, Christoph. So now we have a little bit of a sense of why scenario development is so important for grid planning and managing future uncertainty in that process. I'm going to review FERC's Order 1920 and 1920A requirements for transmission planners to conduct scenario development. So one note first, as a precursor to PJM conducting scenario development, before any 5-year Order 1920 planning cycle begins, PJM has to get FERC's approval on how it will comply with Order 1920. It will do this by filing updates to its tariff, which is a FERC-approved document setting out rates, terms and conditions of service, and planning procedures. PJM's filed tariff will describe how it will comply with Order 1920's requirements. Now, PJM has already asked, and FERC has already granted it an extension on submitting that filing until December 2025. In this filing, PJM must outline how it will solicit input from stakeholders during the scenario development phase, as well as other process points that will govern every planning cycle moving forward. So now let's first look at how scenario development fits into the overall Order 1920 process. First, Order 1920 requires PJM to conduct long-term regional planning cycles every 5 years, with scenario development, as Christoph has described, the first step in each of these planning cycles. PJM has told FERC it intends to start its first Order 1920 planning cycle by June of 2027. So there's plenty of time to develop these scenarios. And during the scenario development, which will be the first phase of each planning cycle, either PJM or stakeholders must identify relevant factors that are driving the need for new transmission capacity. PJM will run these scenarios and will reflect these factors through its models, determine where, how much, and what type of new transmission capacity is needed. PJM will then evaluate the costs and benefits of potential or proposed facilities that might meet the needs it identifies under each scenario and across all scenarios. If PJM selects facilities to include in a long-term plan, then PJM will eventually allocate the cost of those facilities in a way that's roughly commensurate with the benefits they deliver. So scenario development is therefore critical for, number one, identifying what kind of transmission capacity we need. Number two, evaluating which proposed facilities will provide which benefits. And number three, for following the agreed upon cost allocation formula. Next slide, please. So specifically, during each planning cycle, Order 1920 requires PJM to develop at least 3 long-term scenarios using at least a 20-year planning horizon, so the scenarios can best assess how the grid is likely to change and what needs will arise over that time period. Each of the 3 scenarios must be plausible, meaning that they capture reasonably likely future conditions. They must also be diverse, meaning that they're different enough to assess how transmission needs and facility benefits vary across a range of possible futures. Order 1920 requires PJM to also develop at least one sensitivity showing the effects of multiple concurrent sustained generation and/or transmission outages due to an extreme weather event over a wide geographic area. PJM has to then apply that sensitivity to test the robustness of each scenario. Importantly, PJM must use best available data, and this is an Order 1920 defined term, across 7 enumerated categories of factors that drive transmission needs. Here, the best available data is a defined term that means it's been developed using best practices, diverse and expert perspectives. The data must also be timely, meaning that PJM should update the inputs at least once per 5-year planning cycle. This is really important as our energy landscape changes quickly. Kelly will describe each category in detail in a few minutes. For now, we want to emphasize that Order 1920 and 1920A provide an essential role for states in developing these scenarios. PJM must establish an open and transparent process that will provide stakeholders, including states, a meaningful opportunity to give timely input. Order 1920 says that a meaningful opportunity means the opportunity to propose factors, to identify the best available data sources that describe those factors, to describe exactly how those factors might impact long-term transmission needs, and to also explain to PJM how it should incorporate the factors into its scenario. Orders 1920 and 1920A define relevant state entities as those responsible for electric utility regulation or siting electric transmission facilities within the state, and give them a special role here. Order 1920A amplified state's role, further specifying that PJM must consult relevant state entities and any other entities that those siting or regulatory entities authorize to identify state policies that should be included in the scenario. And importantly, directs PJM to rely on the state in determining how to account for those policies. Next slide, please. So states have an important role both during PJM's compliance filing phase and each planning cycle. Let's quickly touch on the compliance phase. Right now, PJM is engaged in consulting with states on what should go into its compliance filing. This phase continues until December, and it gives the states a chance to have a say in the procedures that PJM will adopt in its FERC file tariff, which will also guide all future planning cycles. For example, states can recommend that PJM adopt an iterative planning process requiring state review and feedback on PJM's initial set of modeling inputs, and even enshrining a timeline in the tariff for state requests to see preliminary results before PJM finalizes its scenarios for each planning cycle. States can and should also ask PJM to commit to using more than the 1920 required 3 scenarios and 1 sensitivity, because this will help more robustly reveal and plan for future uncertainty about grid needs. States can and should also request that PJM commit to providing adequate notice of opportunities for participation in each planning cycle, including minimum advance notice of opportunities for comment or input, and a description of what form that input can take. Finally, because relevant data is scattered across various agencies, states can start now by creating internal systems to facilitate data collection. Such systems could look like appointing an executive officer or a PUC liaison or conducting outreach to local government actors. Now, turning to planning phase participation opportunities. Here in the planning phase, each cycle, state participation is equally critical because state input will heavily influence which factors PJM includes in its scenario. States that fail to participate risk ending up with scenarios and therefore transmission expansion plans that don't reflect their policies and priorities. Because PJM must provide a meaningful opportunity for input, states have to be prepared to identify factors in each category and the sources of best available data for those factors, and also to explain how those factors will likely affect transmission needs. And finally, how PJM should be incorporating them into each scenario. States can also propose additional factors they believe will drive transmission needs for scenario inclusion. To maximize the chances that PJM will include its proposed factors into planning scenarios, states should present the information in a way that makes it easy for PJM to incorporate that factor into the model. That will often require quantifying the data and translating the factors into impacts on grid resources and demand. Next, Kelly will walk through each of the 7 categories of factors that Order 1920 requires PJM to incorporate into its modeling, and explain how states might provide relevant data or input for each factor. Kelly?
Thanks, Ben. So before I begin, I just want to remind everyone that you should submit your questions for the Q&A portion of this event using the button at the bottom of your screen. So we're about halfway through our slides, so get your questions in now. So as Jen mentioned during her overview of Order 1920's requirements, PJM has to include 7 categories of information when it's building its scenarios. Those categories cover factors that FERC has determined are likely to drive long-term transmission needs. Each scenario has to include data inputs representing factors from all 7 categories. I'm going to walk through each category one by one in a minute, but there are a few overarching points to keep in mind here. First, PJM is permitted to discount factors within certain categories, but not others. Discounting means that PJM can make an assessment about the extent to which a factor is likely to affect long-term needs, and then weigh that factor accordingly. The PJM can discount factors in categories 4 through 7, which are on the bottom half of this figure. Those categories cover cost trends for fuel and technology, resource retirements, generator interconnection requests, utility commitments, and non-binding policy goals. PJM is not allowed to discount factors falling within the first 3 categories on the top of your screen. And those cover certain laws and regulations, integrated resource plans, and supply obligations. I'm going to explain a bit more about what it looks like to discount or not discount the factors as I go through each category. The second important thing to keep in mind is that PJM is allowed to rely entirely on stakeholders to identify factors within categories 1, 2, 3, and 7, which are depicted in blue. State input is thus especially important for those categories. For categories 4, 5, and 6, on the other hand, which are in green, PJM has to independently identify the factors, and even if they're not raised by stakeholders, but it can still consider input from stakeholders on its assumptions and data sources. The final point is that PJM does not have to include an individual factor, which could be one specific policy or one type of cost trend for a specific technology, if it determines that that factor is unlikely to impact long-term needs at all. So it's especially important when presenting information to PJM to make clear how each factor is likely to have at least some impact on the need for new transmission. These factors are the core of scenario development. As we'll see, scenario development requires a significant amount of work by states, including identifying data sources to depict the relevant factors, explaining how those factors will drive transmission needs, and proposing to PJM how it can input the data into its transmission model. Without state participation, PJM could end up making inaccurate assumptions or excluding relevant factors altogether. So now I'm going to walk through the categories one by one to provide specific recommendations on how states can contribute relevant input for each. Next slide, please. Categories 1 and 2 concern laws and regulations that fall within 2 different buckets. Category 1 covers laws and regulations affecting resource mix and demand, and Category 2 includes laws and regulations on decarbonization and electrification. State, federal, tribal, and local laws all count for these 2 categories. The relevant policies in Category 1 might include energy portfolio standards, installed capacity targets, tax incentives for energy-intensive end uses like data centers, and emissions limits that require generators to invest in new technology or otherwise retire. Relevant policies in Category 2 might include low-carbon generation tax credits, carbon-specific emission standards for power plants, and policies promoting the electrification of buildings and vehicles. Whether a law or regulation is labeled as Category 1 or 2 doesn't ultimately matter because PJM cannot discount factors in either category. That means that PJM has to assume that legally binding obligations will be met unless and until there is a change in law. What that means in practice depends on the type of policy. If a state has adopted a legally binding minimum requirement, for example, a state law that requires the deployment of 5 gigawatts of storage resources by 2030, PJM has to assume in all of its scenarios that at least 5 gigawatts of storage will be built by that date. PJM can exceed that threshold in 1 or more of its scenarios, but it can't develop any scenarios inconsistent with that minimum. Order 1920 also makes clear that incentive programs like tax credits fall within categories 1 and 2. And for those policies, PJM has to assume that the credit will be offered and that the state will honor it, though it can vary its assumptions about the level of uptake across scenarios. PJM is not required to independently identify category 1 and 2 factors, and instead it can rely on stakeholders to bring them to its attention. As Jen mentioned earlier, PJM must consult with and consider the positions of relevant state entities regarding how to account for state policies in its scenarios. That input will be most effective if states can translate their policies into the downstream effects on resource mix and demand. So states should do their best to provide PJM with quantitative assessments of how policies will affect things like generator retirements, demand growth, and the future generation mix, for example. The more accurately states are able to communicate the effect of their policies on the future grid, the better PJM will be able to plan for investments that account for those policies. To give a more concrete example of what this looks like, Christoph is going to briefly explain how a state might communicate one specific type of state policies promoting the adoption of electric vehicles to PJM. We can go to the next slide.
Thank you, Kelly. I want to talk about one specific policy, and this is EV, electric vehicle policy. The reason why we selected that is that many states have adopted tax incentives encouraging the adoption of EVs. And the possible impact on mixed load and flexibility of this policy is kind of twofold. The trivial one is that it will increase electric load, but it's not so clear at what time exactly, at what time of the day. But the other, a little bit more complex impact is that it could also serve as a flexibility asset because of the batteries in the electric vehicles, so they can actually like provide flexibility to the grid if the mechanisms would be in place. So it's important to recognize that simply reporting to PJM that a state has an electric vehicle policies might not be enough, because PJM at some point has to operationalize the policy, which means to like translate it into input data. PJM has in the past, for example, contracted with data vendors such as S&P to kind of produce forecasts of EV uptake, and may adopt assumptions about how people, how it would map into like hourly load profiles or hourly charge and discharge availability. So here is kind of an opportunity for states to clarify those assumptions, also look into the data that will be provided by a third-party vendor, and to make sure that this is consistent with the view of the state. Also important that for state PUCs, for example, is to report the availability of time variant pricing, because that's likely to affect when people will charge their EVs and the hours where the storage capacity will be distributed over the day. So that was on EVs, and I'll return to Kelly to continue explaining the rest of the factor categories.
Here, we can go to the next slide. So now turning to category 3. This category includes state-approved integrated resource plans, or IRPs, expected supply obligations for load-serving entities. Factors in this category provide relevant information concerning resource planning and anticipated changes to demand, including the integration of distributed energy resources. Like categories 1 and 2, PJM is not permitted to discount these factors. It has to assume that utilities follow state-approved IRPs and that load-serving entities will meet their expected supply obligations fully. Also, like the first two categories, PJM is not required to independently identify IRPs or supply obligations and can rely on stakeholder input for these factors. State public utility commissions in particular have relevant information here. For example, PUCs could provide PJM with power system trajectories for the utilities that they regulate. State PUCs might also consider requiring regulated entities to disclose their methods for predicting future grid requirements. and then assess the plausibility of those assumptions. For example, in light of recent studies showing that data center load can be flexible, states can require utilities to disclose whether energy-intensive end uses have flexibility potential. Those steps can ensure that PJM has the most accurate information possible. Next slide, please. For the next three categories, categories 4, 5, and 6, PJM is the one responsible for identifying the factors, regardless of whether states bring them to PJM's attention. States can and should still play a role in identifying data sources and in reviewing PJM's assumptions. Category 4 covers fuel and technology trends. Relevant factors here include anticipated costs of different fuel sources, such as projected natural gas prices, as well as the cost, performance, and availability of different energy technologies, like utility scale generation, distributed energy resources, storage technologies, carbon capture and sequestration, modular nuclear, electric vehicles, and heat pumps. PJM can discount factors in this category, which means that it can make assumptions about the extent to which projected trends will be fully realized or even possibly exceeded. In its initial meetings on Order 1920, PJM has identified certain data sources that it may rely on to represent fuel and technology costs. States can review those assumptions and data sources and provide more granular state-level input where relevant. Next slide. As just one example, in this table, we can see potential geographic adjustments that PJM has proposed making to the capital cost of different generation technologies. So this table shows relative capital costs for combustion and closed cycle gas turbines, solar, onshore and offshore wind, and battery storage in different PJM regions. States may want to weigh in on whether those regional adjustments are plausible. In particular, state PUCs can collect and report data from utilities, product developers, or other data providers on the costs of projects and resources in their jurisdictions to validate PJM's data. Next slide. So category 5 covers resource retirements. This category includes both publicly announced retirements and anticipated retirements due to economic factors. PJM is allowed to discount factors in this category, meaning that it can make assumptions about the likelihood that facilities will retire by a certain date. For example, PJM has proposed assuming that generation facilities subject to certain state and federal emissions regulations will not make the necessary investments needed to comply with those regulations, but will instead deactivate by the compliance deadline. States should provide input on assumptions like those, incorporating any more specific knowledge that they have of individual facilities' deactivation plans and retirement timelines. Next slide. Category 6 covers generator interconnection requests and withdrawals. Order 1920 recognizes that projects in the interconnection queue may ultimately prove to be duplicative or speculative, and it allows PJM to discount factors in this category by assessing the likelihood that projects in the queue will ultimately reach completion. States can provide feedback on PJM's assumptions about the likelihood that projects will be developed. In particular, PUCs could provide up-to-date data on project permitting status and any siting restrictions that would reduce the likelihood that a project may get built. On the other hand, states may want to call attention to energy siting opportunity zones where projects are more likely to be constructed. And next slide, please. So the final category, category 7, covers utility commitments and non-binding policy goals. Like categories 1 through 3, PJM is not responsible for identifying factors within this category and can rely entirely on stakeholders. With respect to utility commitments, public utility commissions can report utilities' voluntary targets concerning energy procurement and usage, and PJM can then discount those commitments, meaning that it doesn't have to assume that a target will be met. To the extent possible, state PUCs should therefore weigh in on the likelihood that targets are achievable. Any goals that have been incorporated into an IRP, however, must be assessed under category 3 and can't be discounted. Unlike state policies that are included in category 1 and 2, PJM can discount any non-binding policy goals. So if a state or municipality has adopted a non-binding goal of adding 5 gigawatts of storage resources by 2030, PJM could decide that that goal is unlikely to be met and then assume that less than 5 gigawatts will eventually be added because of that goal. To ensure that policies are fully accounted for and not discounted, states should consider codifying any goals that are related to resource mix, demand, electrification, or decarbonization, which would shift the policy into category 1 and 2. Barring that, states should otherwise provide as much information to PJM as possible on why their goal is likely to be achieved, such as demonstrating that interim targets have been met or that the goals align with overall market trends. Next slide. So as you can see, long-term scenario development is a very data-intensive and analytically complex undertaking. Successful scenario development cannot happen without active state participation. States are the best sources of data for many factors that drive long-term transmission needs, and PJM can rely entirely on the states to identify many of the factors we just covered. State participation and input into scenario development is critical to ensure that PJM's model accurately reflects what the grid is likely to look like in the future. Better model inputs will result in PJM more precisely identifying where transmission is needed, and an accurate assessment of need allows PJM to determine which facilities will cost effectively meet those needs. States should get involved as soon as possible by plugging into the compliance filing process and should stay involved throughout each planning cycle to ensure that PJM uses the most up-to-date data in its scenarios. Failing to participate means that you might end up with a long-term plan that doesn't account for your needs and priorities. And that concludes our presentation for today. I'm going to share my email in the chat in case you have any follow-up questions, and I'll pass it back to Elizabeth to moderate our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And I see everyone's got their cameras on. So thanks also, Jen and Christoph. I'm going to start by posing sort of a level setting question that came up in the Q&A, which is, can you walk through the timeline again concerning the compliance planning process and the start of the planning cycle?
Sure, I can take this one. So the compliance process is underway now, and PJM has through December 2025 to complete it and to file its amended tariff, which is the document that will contain all the requirements that will govern its Order 1920 planning cycles going forward with FERC. PJM is also committed that its first planning cycle will start by June 2027. And so at the start of that cycle will be the scenario development. Each planning cycle has to wrap up within 5 years. So the scenario development doesn't need to necessarily wait from a state perspective. States right now can start aggregating data. They can start evaluating their policies and potential impact. They can start changing their own rules and regulations to align with the need to make these kinds of 20-year out projections.
Yeah, that's great. And actually that relates to another question that arose in the chat or in the Q&A that I'll throw back at you, which is, do the state filed IRPs and assumptions generally extend out to the 20-year time frame that PJM will be looking at, and how can states ensure the scenarios are consistent with state goals beyond the 10-year horizon or beyond whatever horizon they're dealing with?
Yeah, so in PJM, I think that Virginia's IRPs would be the most salient, and I'm not sure of the time horizon, but my answer would be that state PUCs have vast wells of authority from which they can draw to require their utilities to plan along reasonable time horizons and they can align those horizons with the 20-year planning process. So if the IRP does not require a 20-year lookout, a state can certainly change its rules of the game to require that kind of 20-year lookout, because these are long-lived and long-term investments. And so having a longer planning horizon is beneficial in any event.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And actually, I'm gonna stick with this theme a little, which is, can you talk a little about what oversight states have of how their policies are put into the 7 factors and the scenario, and make sure the assumptions are adequately incorporate the reality of their states?
Sure. So this is something we just touched on briefly a little bit earlier, but during this phase, which is the phase in which PJM is kind of organizing the rules of the road, the compliance phase that will govern each planning cycle, states can ask for this kind of transparency. And states can certainly ask that PJM enshrine in its tariff that for each planning cycle, it has the opportunity to examine the modeling assumptions and to examine exactly how the factors are incorporated in each scenario. States can request additional scenarios or can request additional sensitivities to ensure that any uncertainty the state predicts is adequately reflected and modeled and planned for.
Thanks, Jen. Switching gears a little, when PJM uses scenarios to identify needs, how are those needs identified? And how do states have input into needs?
I can take this one. In PJM, they have what is called the sponsorship model, which means that PJM is is like trying to find needs for transmission upgrades and then ask transmission providers to provide solutions, and then they select solutions. How are they going to do that, and how is it related to scenarios? So the scenarios will create these needs, and what PJM actually will be doing is they will have like the different scenarios that will give them different investment decisions in different generation assets like solar, wind, gas, you name it, in different locations at the grid. Then they run a power flow model, and then they look at constraint violations. So they run the power flow model using the actual topology of the grid and the actual capacity of the grid. And then using the scenario analysis, they will find, well, under this scenario, I have violations here, there, and there. And then this will trigger like an upgrade, a grid upgrade a demand.
Thanks, Christoph. Here's one. With energy policy in flux, how is PJM supposed to make accurate predictions about the next 20 years?
I think I can take this one as well. I think nobody can take accurate predictions over the next 20 years. I certainly cannot, but that's why the scenario planning comes into place. We want to make sure that we have like, a distribution of potential outcomes. And so we don't want to like rely on one prediction, because the likelihood that we will get this one prediction is wrong is very high. So we want to have like several scenarios and want to have like a robust planning process that will give us a solution that is as robust as possible to like a wide range of different scenarios. That's how I think about the whole process.
That's great, thanks. We're not used to thinking about economic development policy as an energy policy in the same way as, for example, a renewable portfolio standard is. And does Order 1920 treat these types of policies differently?
I can answer that question. before I get to that, I just wanted to add a tiny point to Jen's answer to the question about how states will know whether their feedback's incorporated. Order 1920 actually requires PJM to publish on a public website several pieces of information. So it has to publicize the list of factors that it ultimately accounts for in the scenarios, how they accounted for that factor in the scenario, a description of the extent to which they will discount any of the factors in categories 4 through 7, and then a list of the factors that they considered but did not incorporate. So states should have some visibility into how their feedback was or wasn't incorporated. And I think, as Jen mentioned, it's totally possible to ask PJM to then provide another round of feedback or sort of an opportunity to respond to PJM's initial list of factors. But as to the point about which policies are incorporated, I think ultimately Order 9020 doesn't differentiate between things that we might think of as general economic development policy and policies that are more directly targeted at the grid or resources on the grid. As I mentioned, Category 1 covers laws and regulations affecting resource mix and demand, and Category 2 covers laws and regulations that concern decarbonization and electrification. So both of those categories could include a wide range of policies, both supply and demand side policies, and PJM has to include both when developing each scenario. And I think the reason for that goes back to the purpose of scenario development, which is how to account for all of the factors that are going to drive the need for new transmission in the future. Order 1920 says basically every policy from tax incentives and state regulation of generation down to local economic development policy is something that's going to change the quantity of generation and load, and those things ultimately contribute to transmission needs. So that's all to say that the policies are going to affect what the grid looks like, regardless of whether PJM accounts for them. So it's better for PJM to incorporate as much information as possible so that it can accurately project need down the line.
Thank you so much, Kelly. What advice might you have for states that might not have or think they have the technical capacity to collect data or to present it in the ways that that are being recommended here?
I think I can say something about that. So anything that is kind of quantifiable, I think, is useful. So like data, like data formats that can be like like spreadsheets or like other like easy to like process information for like in terms of like modeling world. Policies should be expressed to the extent possible in terms of the policy's impact on the resource mix or on demand, presenting a policy in a way that makes it simple for PJM to incorporate it into their like modeling will, I think, increase the likelihood that the policy is accurately reflected. Another option would be for states, because I guess this is like a very demanding task for everyone, to also like hire a third-party consultant to help collecting the relevant data and translating them into model inputs. So I think generally it's important to emphasize that potentially ratepayers are here on the hook for like really like expensive investments. So it pays off, I think, to invest some money into like getting the scenarios like really right, or as right as possible. And so even if there are like upfront costs to hire a consultant to like help managing this data gathering process, I think that that money could be well spent.
Thanks, Christoph. Does any of you want to speak to what happens when states have conflicting priorities, conflicting policies?
Sure, I can answer that. So I think that Order 1920 acknowledges that sometimes a policy adopted by one state is gonna, sort of like negate the effect of a policy in a different state, where they might have conflicting aims. Order 1920 says you still have to account for all of those policies. You can't just ignore them or discount them because different states say different things. But PJM can account for those policies in the aggregate. So it could, if one policy is going to increase demand and another policy is going to decrease demand, PJM could kind of combine that together and then have one aggregate prediction about future demand forecast. Sometimes it might not be possible to reconcile factors because they just imply completely incompatible alternatives to the same input. But that's where transmission providers can use multiple scenarios to account for that factor. So you might have one value in one scenario and a different value in a different scenario. It's also a great opportunity to use more than the 3 required scenarios to sort of see how transmission needs play out when you account for certain alternatives versus others. And I think ultimately the policies all need to make it into the scenario development process in some form, but it might not always be possible to reconcile them in the same exact scenario.
Yeah, Kelly, that's actually a great segue to a question I was going to pose to Christoph, which is if he has any thoughts or guidance on what kinds of additional scenarios, sensitivities, factors states should require.
Yes. So, if you start thinking about what could happen in the future, there's probably like a lot you could come up with, but some immediate things is like, cyber security attacks could be one sensitivity states may want to consider, or are there like fuel price shocks? So there's like a lot of different sensitivities that should be probably like run to make sure to have this robust planning results.
Thanks so much. Wondering if you have thoughts on how a state might argue against discounting of its non-binding goals.
Sure, I can answer that, and maybe to incorporate another question we received. I just wanted to clarify that discounting in the context of Order 1920 scenario development is different from what we might typically think of discounting in terms of like identifying the present value of investments. Order 1920 uses discounting effectively to say that PJM can make assumptions about whether a particular goal is likely to be met or a certain trend is likely to be realized in full. So it's not necessarily about applying a certain discount rate, but it's about making assumptions about whether a particular factor is likely to have a full effect on long-term transmission needs, or if a projection is not going to be fully realized. And so, as I mentioned, PJM is not allowed to discount the Category 1 and 2 policies, but for policies falling within Category 7, so non-binding goals, PJM can determine that those are unlikely to be met. And one way states could argue against that type of discounting are to provide evidence of implementation plans or possibly interim goals that regulatory bodies have sort of adopted, and even if those don't have fully binding legal effect, demonstrating that there are sort of interim points of progress and that the state has achieved those interim goals can increase the likelihood that PJM thinks that the goal will ultimately be met and should be fully accounted for in the scenario.
Excellent, Kelly. Thank you. I think we're getting toward the end, but I'm going to ask one last question, which is, demand forecasts can be pretty variable and, hard to know whether demand will materialize. And what can states do about potential large loads?
I can take this one, and then maybe Christoph can also help answer. But from a regulatory perspective, states can talk to their utilities to reveal what structures are in place for them to determine or ascertain how certain the load is to show up. And in turn, the large load end users, data centers, or whatever those end uses are, can also provide information and transparency about their ability to be flexible, whether it's flexibility across hours of a day or flexibility between load centers in a particular zone. And so the more transparency states can call for from utilities and provide their own forecasts or assumptions to PJM, the less wildly variable the forecast might be. And this is really important for a geographic area as large as PJM is.
Thank you, Jen. I think with that, we will wrap it up.
I think Christoph was going to jump in.
Christoph is joining in. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you, Jan. It's you know, the first attempt, I would also like go to the utilities, find out what kind of contracts they have actually signed, and is it like a base load demand, or is it like something that's variable? This is like super like useful information for modeling sides. And then to like repeat myself is, if there's still uncertainty about what is going to happen, then you're back to scenario planning.
Sorry about that, Christoph. With that, we can wrap it up. Thanks again so much for joining us and for posing some really great questions. And in case anyone would like to reach out to us after the webinar, Kelly's email address is in the chat, and we would love to hear from you. Thanks again to all, and have a great day.